Okay, Yidden, we're part 3 of our discussion on elective cosmetic surgery, right? So the question at hand is, if a person can do procedures to their body, but there's no medical need, it's just a personal desire. That's essentially what it comes down to. Can a person mess with their body, cut open their body and do some sort of surgery to their body without any medical need, but just for personal gain? So we began with the opinion of the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Waldenberg, who essentially argued, following the Ramban and others, who come from the angle that, in theory, Hashem does all the healing, and if we lived in a perfect, miraculous world, Hashem would do all the healing, and we'd never have to go to doctors, and we never would be allowed to go to doctors. Going to a doctor would be blasphemous because you're denying God's healing in an ideal world. But considering that we're not in an ideal world, Torah grants permission for the doctors to heal, and therefore the Tzitz Eliezer essentially argues that the permission granted for doctors to heal is limited to healing. And if it's not a question of direct healing, as is the case with elective cosmetic surgery, forbidden to touch the body. This is essentially Rabbi Waldenberg's position. And again, we discussed a little bit what that might mean, what would qualify as a medical need. I would argue that psychological medical need counts. All right, I gave the example of a cleft. I said cleft palate. It was a mistake. My brother watched the video, he corrected me. It's cleft lip, not palate. Well, there's no technical medical issue, but psychologically speaking, a girl walking around with a cleft lip could be very scarring and damaging, so it wasn't even a question. They fixed it for her. And likewise, such similar things. But if it's purely elective, then no. And specifically, Rabbi Waldenberg spoke harshly of a culture that's chasing body modification for look. Oh, my neighbors did this job, so I want to get it also, and everybody's running around changing. And he quoted a number of stories in the Gemara in which we had the famous story where the person who looked ugly and told off a sage who called him ugly, saying, "Go to the one who makes me," right? Does Hashem make me this way? What are we altering it for? And the story of the Gemara, what was the other story? Where the person who went and asked for a miracle that his wife should look appealing to him.
Yes, and she became naughty.
That's right, and when she became pretty, miraculously she became haughty and insufferable. So he went and prayed that she should go back. The point of the Gemara is that Hashem knows what He's doing, and He makes everybody the way they're supposed to be, and leave it that way. This is what Rabbi Waldenberg was talking about. And as I mentioned, he wasn't addressing a specific case. He's more speaking to a culture of changing oneself just for the sake of looking better. Now, Rabbi Feinstein comes from a different direction. Rabbi Feinstein comes, first of all, he addresses a specific person. He says there was a specific girl who asked him if she can have some sort of surgery, cosmetic surgery, and the reason is because she wants to get married, and she feels that she's not appealing to young men, and she wants to make herself in such a way that someone will marry her. So there's kind of like a motive which isn't necessarily purely, I mean, it's selfish, but it's not, running after the culture of just changing their look. Maybe there's a little bit more of a subtlety to what she wants. And he comes from it from the angle of, does this constitute a violation of the prohibition to damage oneself? One is not allowed to injure oneself. It's the halacha. A person may not injure himself, and unless there's medical need. So since there's no medical need and the person's technically injuring themselves, cutting themselves open and doing whatever kind of surgeries, is this permitted? This is where he comes from. Now we began last week. Okay, let's begin. Let's go from the beginning of the Teshuva, right from the beginning. So we're looking at this text here. We'll do we read the first paragraph, but we'll read it again. But we also read the Gemara upon which that paragraph is based, but we're not going to go through that. And essentially what we learn from the Gemara is like this. There was a story with Rabbi Kiva, a person who pulled off the head covering of a woman in public, embarrassed her. So the woman came to Rabbi Kiva and said, "I want a judgment. This guy publicly embarrassed me." So Rabbi Kiva said he has to give X amount of money. The person came to Rabbi Kiva and said, "Give me some time, I'll pay her." In the meantime, he waited for outside her house. As she was walking out, he dumped on the floor a bunch of expensive oil. She herself took off her head covering, started grabbing the oil and putting it onto her own head because she wanted that great expensive oil, whatever it was. So the guy comes back to Rabbi Kiva and says, "For this woman, I'm giving her money for embarrassing her, taking off her head covering. She did it herself, she doesn't care." So Rabbi Kiva said, "You're saying the wrong thing. Even though a person is not allowed to damage himself, right? She wasn't allowed to do that to herself, publicly embarrass herself, but one who does so is not liable. You, on the other hand, are liable, and what she does is irrelevant to you." So this is the Mishnah, which states that a person is not allowed to impose any damage upon themselves, and self-injury, even self-shame is forbidden. It's only that you're not liable to pay, because who are you going to pay? Yourself. You don't have to pay anybody, but still forbidden. And we discussed how the Gemara goes back and forth discussing what exactly is the source for this prohibition and who is the author of this Mishnah. Who is the one behind this Mishnah that's of the view that one may not damage themselves. And the Gemara concludes that it's Rabbi Eliezer HaKafar. Rabbi Eliezer HaKafar Berebi, he says that a Nazir has to bring a sin offering. Why does a Nazir have to bring a sin offering at the end of his Nazireth? Right, the Nazir is the one who vows to, following me? Yeah, the Nazir is the one who vows to celibacy. Yeah, so for a certain amount of time he doesn't drink wine and lets his hair grow. And when he's done, he's got to bring a sin offering. What's the sin? Says Rabbi Eliezer, because for a month you deprived yourself of wine, and that's a sin to deprive yourself. If it's a sin to deprive myself of wine, certainly it's a sin to hit myself or to damage myself. And this is the source of the Gemara for this view. Right, this is where last piece that we learned last week is Rabbi Feinstein quoted the Tosfos there. And the Tosfos says, Afilu l'tzairach, even if there's a need as to what I'm gaining something out of inflicting pain upon myself, still not allowed to. And this was the question that Rabbi Feinstein begins with. He opens up a discussion, this question on Tosfos. Why would Tosfos conclude that if there's some sort of need or some sort of gain to be had out of self-injury, why is it forbidden? If we're deriving from the issue of the guy who's drinking wine, who's refraining from wine for a month and he's called a sinner, if a person's, let's say, being paid money not to drink wine, he's not allowed to do that. So for some gain, seemingly you should be allowed to self-injure. And because this woman has some gain, by making herself look more beautiful and more attractive to prospective husbands, so seemingly she should be allowed to. This is Rabbi Feinstein's challenge to Tosfos. This is where we are. Yeah, remember all this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Okay,
I
so...
just want to add very quickly,
yeah.
and this is just a parenthesis though. Maybe the fact that she wants to change to look more beautiful, it's a reflection on society. The way how society sees women. So she in a way is a victim of societal perspectives.
Yes, I think that's a good point, that she's a victim of society's perspective of what beauties, and I think that was Rabbi Waldenberg's main point. Just because society says this is beautiful, not beautiful, you're giving in. Maybe that's kind of where...
You can see what she wants. Her nose is crooked, it's not society.
Yeah, so that's the other...
Depends what she wants.
That's right, that was the other point.
Rabbi Feinstein... She's not getting married because of how she looks.
So maybe her nose is messed up. That's
right, so...
society. That's
no, so...
you have to fix.
I think what Yossi's saying is that Rabbi Feinstein doesn't tell us what she wanted to do, right, or what she looked like before. Maybe there was real deformity. Right?
Okay.
Maybe there's a more real deformity. But again, it has to... This deformity can't have a psychological effect, because if it did, then I would think it's medical, right? So it has to, it's on the border of being unattractive, but not so much that it causes her any psychological damage. It would seem to me that it has to be on the border there. So I'm not exactly. I don't want to get too technical exactly what kind of issue she's dealing with, but Rabbi Feinstein seems to be talking about it in a broad sense. Does doing a surgery for beautification constitute a violation of the prohibition of inflicting damage upon oneself? Yeah, this is where we are. But these are good points. These are valid points. Okay, so that was basically a summary of the first paragraph. So let's go to the second paragraph.
He's most likely talking about not like the nose thing. You just want to help yourself out a bit more. Otherwise, there's no question. If your nose is crooked. That's right. That's what I'm saying. If she's being ridiculed, let's say, and wherever she goes, she feels like psychologically scarred, I would imagine that constitutes a medical need. So, yeah, Rabbi Feinstein seems to be saying just let's see how he describes it. She wants to make herself more beautiful. Doesn't describe her as a young girl who has a defect that she wants to fix. That's not how he describes it. She wants to make herself more beautiful, so that men will jump upon her to marry her. That's literally the description. That's the terminology he uses. So it doesn't seem like it's any sort of drastic defect. Yeah. Okay.
If you're so attracted that I could
Yeah, she wants to be beautiful for yeah.
Right.
No. Anyway, when we're done the Teshuva, I'll make a comment about what I think might be going on behind Rabbi Feinstein's mind, and I'll tell you some proofs to why I think that's the case. But let's see for now what he says. Okay, so let's go to the last paragraph on the left side there, the bottom. So our question again is, Tosfos said that even if there's a need, even if there's a gain to be had by inflicting damage upon oneself, still forbidden. And Rabbi Feinstein argues, seemingly, if the source for why you're not allowed to inflict pain upon yourself is because it's a sin to not drink wine for 30 days, seemingly, if a person had money to be gained by not drinking wine, certainly it's permissible. So if that's the source of the law, then certainly if there's something to be gained by inflicting damage, it should be permissible. This is his argument at the moment. So we have to distinguish then, in order to substantiate Tosfos' view, which says it's forbidden to inflict pain even if there's something to be gained, we have to substantiate that view. So let's see. The Tzarech Lemar, we must say, and here's an interesting differentiation, which the end is going to disregard anyway, but it's still an interesting differentiation, which actually becomes relevant for a different idea. Let's see. The Tzarech Lemar, we must say, Shebeyayin, when it comes to wine, Hameneya Melishtos, someone who refrains from drinking, Bishvil Eizar Vacha, for some sort of gain, Lo Nechshav Klal Mitzdar Mizeh. This does not constitute inflicting pain upon yourself, even though he's stopping to drink wine for a month, for a year, whatever it is. Why? Because his gain, his enjoyment, his pleasure from the gain, let's say the cash prize he gets for withholding from wine, is gedola mitzarei, is greater than the pain of withholding back the wine, which is why he's doing it. Right? Because if he goes ahead and drinks wine, and doesn't get that cash prize, he'll have even more pain that he lost the gain. He lost that money cash prize. That he would have gotten if he were to refrain from drinking the wine. Now he explains why. Right? What if a person says the same thing? God forbid, person A says to person B, I'll cut your finger off for $1,000. And the guy says, sure, no problem. And I'm going to be pained if I keep my finger from not having $1,000. Why is it not the same thing? Whatever, $1 million, whatever number you want to put on it. So here he explains the subtlety between refraining from wine versus actually inflicting damage, inflicting pain. What's the pain involved in withholding from drinking wine? It's not a positive pain. It's only the withholding of pleasure. Right? It's only because he really wants the wine, and the pain is that he's refraining from his pleasure. But he has a greater pleasure from the cash prize. So it's not that he's inflicting pain in exchange for pleasure. He's withholding one pleasure for a greater pleasure. That's not the same thing. Right? Following? Yeah. But when he actually injures himself, this is positively painful. Not because, I have a desire to not be pained, and the pain is undoing my pleasure. That's not the issue here. It's positive pain. Following the difference? If I withhold from wine, what's the pain? It's not positive pain, it's a negative pain. It's a pain because I'm not getting what I want. That, you can say, look, I'll withhold one pleasure in exchange for a greater pleasure. Withhold wine for a month in exchange for the cash prize of some theoretical guy who's putting a bet on me. Right? Versus, if I hit myself, whether there's positive actual pain, not because I'm withholding the pleasure of keeping my arm unpunched. It's actual pain from being hit.
They can freeze you and you don't feel it, and they can make...
Okay, so then the guy's not getting a cash prize that way. The whole point is
no, it's saying you just cut your finger off.
Which actually, by the way, this argument we mentioned last week, someone who's boxing for a living. This argument might say it's forbidden to box for a living. Because it's not your withholding pleasure for the sake of another pleasure, the cash prize at the end of the boxing match. You're taking on actual pain, and he's saying that's a problem, at least at this point. So at this point, this might be the case, right? So he says, but someone who actually inflicts pain upon himself, actual damage, shutzar mamish. Sorry?
That's not someone else, himself doing it.
Well,
okay, someone else is doing it.
That's right. Someone else is doing it, but it's with my permission. So it's the same thing as asking the doctor to do a surgery for me, or asking someone else to hit me in the head, right? Or at least be willing to get a hit in the head for the money.
For money, yeah, that's...
Right? So, but someone who hits himself, shutzar mamish, this is positively painful, not because he's withholding some pleasure, and that's the pain here. Like with wine. I want wine, I'm holding back pain. No. This is positively painful. You can't exchange that for the pain of not getting the cash prize. So you can exchange the pleasure of wine for the pleasure of getting greater cash prize, but I cannot exchange positive pain for a pleasure of a gain of a few dollars. That you can't do. Where there it's just pleasure of gain. So pleasure of one gain can outweigh the lack of a different pleasure, but the pleasure of gain cannot outdo positive pain. Following the difference? Okay. And the reason why he's okay getting hit for the cash, because of his great desire, for the cash prize, he wants to absorb the pain. Lisba means to
He wants to get hurt.
to tolerate the pain, and that's forbidden. Because it's not like he's exchanging pleasure for the sake of a greater pleasure. He's tolerating pain for pleasure. That you can't.
And that's forbidden.
That's forbidden.
Okay.
So if this were the model, then seemingly it would be forbidden to be a boxer for a living,
I agree with that.
or even to play football for the same. You have to get into percentages of like what's the rate of someone getting hit in the head, but someone who's a linebacker gets concussion every other game. Right? And, there are studies on the long-term effects of this. It's not nothing. Okay. So this is the way he resolves Tosfos. Tosfos, which says that for gain you're not allowed to damage yourself, is talking about positive damage, actually positively hurting yourself, and that you cannot do even if it's going to result in some cash prize. Now if that's the case, the same thing is true of the cosmetic elective surgery. You're doing positive damage for the sake of a gain. You can't do that. If this were the model, which he's going to reject. But if this were the model, then this is where we would stand. Whereas, when it comes to the issue of wine, there it is permissible to withhold wine for the sake of cash prize, because I'm not positively taking on pain. I'm just withholding one pleasure for the sake of a different pleasure, and that's okay. Yeah? So this is the model at the moment, if we were to go with Tosfos' view. Furthermore, the Gam Ladina, but the law is, in the end, Haloi Kamel Rabbi Eliezer HaKafer Berebi. Rabbi Eliezer HaKafer, who is the one who said this idea that the Nazir is a sinner because he withheld from wine, we don't follow that view. Right? We don't follow that view. We're not of the view that the Nazir is a sinner. Nonetheless, the Rambam rules in the beginning of chapter 5 of the laws of damage, the laws of personal damage, personal injury, that one may not injure oneself. We're going to learn the Rambam inside in a moment. Okay, so Rambam on the one hand does not rule like Rabbi Eliezer when it comes to the issue of Nazir, does not consider the Nazir a sinner, and yet still maintains that you may not inflict a wound upon yourself. If that's the case, he must have some other source for why you're not allowed to inflict a wound upon yourself. So we can maintain that you may not inflict a wound even if there's something to be gained out of it. And as for your question about the wine, well, we're not deriving the law from the wine anyway. Right? Yeah. So he brings the citation. If so, Rambam, which rules that you may not inflict injury upon yourself, is not deriving it from the issue of the Nazir, because he rejects that. But yet he still maintains that you may not inflict a wound upon yourself. And therefore we can say that the prohibition of inflicting a wound upon yourself is universal, even if there happens to be something you gain out of it.
It's universal.
This is, well...
That's the Rambam is saying that.
Not yet. We're going to see Rambam inside in a moment. Oh. Not yet. But look at this. Tosfos wrote that Tosfos wrote that one may not inflict a wound even if there's something to be gained out of it. That's what Tosfos wrote. Rabbi Feinstein rejects and says the whole basis for the idea of not allowed to inflict a wound upon yourself is from the fact that the guy who doesn't drink wine is a sinner. When it comes to someone who doesn't drink wine, one may forego wine for cash. So first we answered by separating the two and saying inflicting wound is different than refraining from pleasure. It's number one. Number two, we're rejecting the premise that the Nazir is the reason why you can't inflict wound upon yourself. What's the proof that we're rejecting the Nazir as the source for why you can't wound yourself? Because Rambam rejects Rabbi Eliezer Kafra and still maintains you're not allowed to hit yourself. So which means he has some other source. If that's the case, we're not limited to the issue of not drinking wine. We can apply the rule universally that you may not inflict wound even if there is something to be gained. Which again means you cannot go for elective cosmetic surgery at this point. But again, we're going to reject this soon. Let's see. This is all for following Tosfos' view, right? But he's going to reject Tosfos' view soon. Now he's going to go a little back and forth. But nonetheless, if we were to say, if we were to maintain Rabbi Eliezer Kafar's view, right? He just wrote that Rambam rejects Rabbi Eliezer Kafar's view, and yet still maintains you're not allowed to inflict a wound upon yourself. But even if we were to maintain Rabbi Eliezer Kafar's view, which is that the Nazir is considered a sinner for not drinking wine, we would have to say that if there's a gain to be had, you're allowed to do it so, because when it comes to wine, you may forego wine for the sake of pleasure. And if this is the source for the law, if hypothetically, we know it's not because Rambam rejects it, but if hypothetically this were the source for the law, as the Gemara seems to imply, then that would mean even if you have something to be gained, you're allowed to do it, because you're allowed to forego wine for the sake of cash prize, and this refraining from wine is the source for the fact that you're not allowed to wound yourself. This would have been a proof universally, because we don't find anywhere in the Gemara anyone who disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer bar Kafar. So, where the Gemara doesn't introduce any contrary opinion, right? And moreover, and this is something you mentioned last week, what was the original case? The original case of the Mishnah was a woman who pulled her own hair off, shamed herself in public by pulling off her own covering. And why? Because she bent down and put oil on her head. And Rabbi Akiva said, even though she wasn't allowed to do that, because one may not inflict a wound upon themselves, even shame, nonetheless, she's not liable to pay herself back. But you who pulled off her covering the other day, you have to pay her. Right? Which means, what's Rabbi Akiva saying? Even if there's something to be gained, pouring the oil on her head, you still may not do it. So we see here that even for gain, you can't. That's the original case of the Gemara, is it not? So which seems to maintain Tosfos' view. Rabbi Akiva's case is considering a situation where there is a need. And it is for this case that Hevia Gemara Rabbi Eliezer bar Kafar, that the Gemara introduces Rabbi Eliezer bar Kafar, right? The Mishnah said the story of Rabbi Akiva. And the Gemara asks, who is the one that's quoting this Mishnah that says you may not damage yourself? Who is that? Rabbi Eliezer bar Kafar, the one who says that the Nazirite is a sinner because he refrained from wine. Which means Rabbi Eliezer bar Kafar is speaking of a case that's similar to the Mishnah where a woman pulled off her own covering to get oil. And even then it's forbidden. Which means Rabbi Eliezer bar Kafar himself must be of the view that even if you have a gain, you may not. Right? Because Rabbi Eliezer Kafar is used as the backup for Rabbi Akiva's story where the woman took off her own covering, shaming herself, for a gain, putting the oil on her head. And Rabbi Eliezer Kafar is quoted as a source for that. Which means Rabbi Eliezer Kafar, who speaks of a person who refrained from wine, is forbidden even if there's to gain. Which now seems to be, which at this point then means that you cannot refrain wine for cash prize either. Never mind, you can't get hit in the head for cash prize. That's what it seems, right? That means, even according to Rabbi Eliezer Kafar, one may not inflict a wound upon themselves, even for a need. Which then seems to contradict the very notion.
She shamed herself. In the case of the wine, you're not shaming, you just don't have the title.
And therefore, you have to go back to my original, this for Rabbi Feinstein says you have to go back to my original distinction. We must distinguish between exchanging one pleasure for another pleasure versus inflicting pain against the pleasure. We must of comparing cases to each other. This is the best way to divide between the two. Yeah. But this all is only in Tosfos' view. All of this whole back and forth, is only to maintain Tosfos' view that one may not inflict pain if there's a gain. And therefore Rabbi Feinstein says that even that is only limited to if you're inflicting a wound upon yourself. Which, by the way, in the Teshuva just before this one, right? This Teshuva, this responsa is number 66 in this section of Rabbi Feinstein's works. Right? Response number 65, if you go back a page, just go back the page just to see because it's fun. He says, top right, diet, is a person allowed to take on a diet if the diet causes pain and just for the sake of beautifying oneself? So if it's a health reason, that's why the doctor says you have to do the diet. Okay, you have to.
Every diet is painful.
But
the whole world's doing diets.
if the doctor says you have to because it's medically important, okay, so you have to. But if it's not medically important, you're doing it just for...
to lose weight.
So what's the story?
Which is a healthy thing.
Everyone does it.
But he says like this.
Everyone's overweight anyway. A little bit. Not you.
Yeah. He goes on to use the example of the cash prize, and he uses, even though he's going to reject the view of Tosfos and say that a person may inflict pain if there's some sort of gain, because he's going to conclude that the woman is allowed to do the elective surgery because she's gaining beauty. But when it comes to the issue of the diet, he says this issue of demarcation. It says, because the pain you're taking upon yourself is not an actual pain, but just the refraining from pleasure, because the pleasure of looking good is better than the pleasure of eating the cake, you're allowed to withhold from the cake for the sake of looking better. He does so. Even though he rejects this demarcation and this responsa for the issue of cosmetic surgery, he does apply it for the issue of diet. Yeah. Yeah, that's what he writes. Sorry?
Do the diet.
Yes. So I'm saying this demarcation, the difference between positively giving yourself pain in exchange for some sort of gain versus foregoing one pleasure for the sake of another pleasure, even though in this response for the issue of elective surgery, he's going to reject that. He's going to say that you're allowed to take on elective surgery for gain, even though it's actual damage. When it comes to the issue of diet, there he says for sure you're allowed to take on the diet in order to look good, because the pain there is not positive pain, but rather just the withholding of pleasure. Right? So you're allowed to forego cake if it's going to make you look better. We're going to see from the Alter Rebbe, when we get to the Alter Rebbe's line, we have to remember all these details when we get to the Alter Rebbe's teaching, because we're going to see how the Alter Rebbe writes it. We'll see if we can apply the Alter Rebbe's line to any of these cases. Yeah, okay, with me so far? So we are in conclusion that in Tosfos' view, the way Rabbi Feinstein frames it, you're allowed to forego one pleasure for the sake of a greater pleasure. That's for sure not a problem. But you may not inflict a wound upon yourself for the sake of a greater pleasure. And thus, if we were to follow Tosfos' view, we would maintain that a woman cannot take elective surgery. Okay, so now let's go to our source sheet, page 3. The source sheet, page 3. So we're looking at Rambam. This is the Rambam he referenced earlier, which is Rambam, the laws of personal. What's the word? Personal damage, personal injury, chayvul mazik, which literally means like damaging and injuring. Laws of personal injury. There he writes. Chapter, right at the beginning of chapter 5. Yeah, chapter 5, law number 1. It is forbidden for a person to injure anyone, neither his own self nor another person. Right? This is the rule. This is the ruling that he cited earlier. Rambam maintains it's forbidden to injure oneself, even though he rejects Rabbi Eliezer Kafir.
So that
Okay.
means no suicide.
Suicide's forbidden in Torah, certainly. Yeah. We can talk about that maybe another time. We can do a Teshuva on suicide. It's an interesting topic. Okay. Sad one and unfortunately relevant nowadays. Okay. Not only a person who causes injury, but anyone who strikes in strife an upright Jewish person, whether a minor or an adult, whether a man or a woman, violates a negative commandment. As it says, do not continue to flog him. Meaning, if a person is liable for lashes by Jewish law, one is right to the court gives him lashes, and the Torah says do not give him more than is required. So that's the prohibition against hitting somebody else, because the court may not administer lashes beyond which Torah says you're allowed to, which means you can't hit anybody. This is the source. Lo yosef, do not add. So one may conclude that if Torah adjures us against adding to the blows due to a sinner, certainly this prohibition applies with regard to striking a righteous person, a random person on the street. You start hitting the person, forbidden. If Torah says this guy's a sinner, with the witnesses and the warnings and the whole thing, to the point that he actually gets lashes by Torah law, which is very difficult for something to happen. Because in order for someone to be liable for lashes, he has to have two witnesses telling him, the act you're about to do is forbidden, and you're going to get lashes. And he has to say, I know, I don't care, and do it anyway within the span of 4 seconds or something, which is very difficult to ever happen. So which means this guy is a convicted sinner, actually made it to the point of lashes. Torah says no more than you cannot add to any lashes than what's required by law. So the more so, you can't just go strike anybody. Okay, but what's the main point here? He says like this: not only a person who causes injury, but anyone who strikes in strife. So what's the prohibition? Is the prohibition against hitting anybody? Only in strife. What if he gives me permission?
What does strife mean?
In angst and anger.
Right.
But what if the guy, what if the guy gave permission though? Guy gave permission to hit him, the boxer.
But that's causing injury.
But it's not in strife.
According to this, it doesn't.
It's not in strife. I gave him permission because we're boxing match and we agreed to the terms of how we're hitting each other. So it's not in strife. So maybe it's forbidden, maybe it's permissible then. That's what he's going to argue. This word in strife.
No, but it causes injury.
But the prohibition is only if it's strife.
Yeah, but even if you allow the person to do so, it's causing harm to you.
No problem, but I'm not liable. I'm not liable from giving permission.
But ultimately, you should not harm yourself. Your body should not be harmed.
But it's only if it's in strife, which means only if there's an anger element to it. But if there's a positive element to it, right? This is a counter view. This is Rambam. So Rabbi Feinstein is going to maintain that Tosfos and Rambam argue. Tosfos is of the view that you may not injure yourself if there's something to be gained, even if something's to be gained. And Rabbi Feinstein is going to argue because of this word that if there's something to be gained by hitting yourself, therefore it's not strife, and therefore you're allowed to say a boxing match or the cosmetic surgery.
Because of this word.
Because of this word. That's what he's going to maintain. So let's see how he plays it out.
Okay.
So, second paragraph in Bezer H Sadik. Aval ba tarambam but the Rambam hakos avaresh perek. He writes at the beginning of chapter 5, which we just read, Mechayvel from the laws of personal injury, Be'isr hakal adam kashim Yisrael, where there he writes it's forbidden to hit someone, to strike someone amongst the Jewish people. Shehu b'maka derech nitzayon. He says it's forbidden to hit someone in a manner of strife, in anger, or unwarranted. That's one version of Rambam. But Lachad Gir said there's another version of Rambam which says derech bizayon, in a way of shame. Ayin sham, see there. So the Hebrew word for strife is nitzayon, and you change two letters, you get bizayon. You change the nun of nitzayon to a beis, which is very similar looking letters anyway, and you change it tzadik to a zayin, which are very similar sounding letters. Instead of nitzayon, strife, you get bizayon, shame. So two versions of the same thing. Don't hit someone in strife, or don't hit someone in a shameful manner. What's similar to both of them is that that's only true if the person didn't give you permission to hit, or if there's nothing to be gained out of it. But if there's something to be gained, then it's not shame, then it's not strife. This is his argument. If so, in this case, shachabala, where they're here, the injury, the surgery, is to make her more beautiful. And this is not strife, because she's lying there and gave permission, she signed the consent form. Ubizoyin, it's certainly not shame. So if it's not strife and not shame, there's no prohibition. And this is true even with the issue of hitting someone else, right? Because it's what he talks about here. Not only a person who causes any injury, but anyone who strikes in strife an upright Jewish person, meaning hitting someone else. Now, if the prohibition against hitting someone else is only if it's in strife or in shame, in a shameful manner, certainly when it comes to inflicting injury upon oneself, it should not be forbidden. If the objective here is to make her more beautiful, to make myself more beautiful. This is not strife, not anger, and not shameful. Okay. Now let's look back at the words of Rambam to understand the next paragraph. Let's look very carefully. So we'll look back at the words of Rambam in page 3 of our source sheet. Second line. Read it slowly so we can hear the words. Not only a person who causes injury. So he begins by saying it is forbidden for a person to injure anyone, neither his own self nor another person. Okay. Now, not only a person who causes an injury, but also who strikes.
Anyone.
You see a difference in language? Not only a person who causes injury, but anyone who strikes. So there's a strike, and then there's injury. Not the same thing. A person can strike someone else without injuring them. So now the next words which says, but anyone who strikes in strife, that word nitzayon, in strife, is that referring to the injury and the striking, or just to the striking? Meaning to say, injury forbidden, even if it's not in strife. Striking only if it's in strife. Following? There's two ways where you can put the comma, depending on how you read that comma. So that's it. Following? So now he said, now let's go back to Rabbi Feinstein's text. That which my dear friend, the rabbi, the sage, Tuvia Goldstein, may live and be well, he pointed out, Miloshan, from the precise language of the Rambam, which writes, not only one who injures, that anyone who strikes another Jew in a manner of strife, say this one is transgressing the prohibition of not to add strike injury, right? One may not add to the lashes. So says my friend that this is, I skipped the line. This is only, this condition that the prohibition is only violated if it's done in a manner of strife, it's only if it's the issue of striking, but not injury. Which means Rabbi Goldstein's arguing, to your point, that if you're injuring somebody else, strife, shame, with permission, without permission, you're injuring you, injury is forbidden. Hitting someone else, if the guy get permission, that's okay. That's what he's saying. That the issue of strife, the condition, that the prohibition is limited to when there is strife or shame is only if you hit someone. But if you injure, then even if there isn't shame, and even if there isn't strife, but if you injure, still liable, still forbidden. This is Rabbi Goldstein's argument. Following? That the word strife only applies to striking, doesn't apply to the injury. And injury is forbidden even if it's not in strife, even if it's with permission. Which means Rabbi Goldstein would say, you may not do cosmetic surgery.
Right. Yeah.
Why? Because it's an injury, even though there's no strife. The issue with the condition of strife, the permissibility of hitting someone without strife, is if there's no injury. This is Rabbi Goldstein's argument. But Rabbi Feinstein says, I don't follow, I don't buy this. It doesn't seem right to me. Why? The prohibition against injuring someone and the prohibition against striking someone is derived from one and the same verse. It's one and the same prohibition, which is the prohibition is you may not hit the sinner beyond that which is allowed in court for him to be hit. And that's how we learn that you may not injure nor may strike. So if you have one source, and because Rambam rules that adding, if the court were to give the guy 41 lashes instead of 40, or 40 instead of 39, Rambam is of the view that that's considered strife and that's considered shameful, giving him more punishment than necessary. And therefore, that's the root prohibition, both of which are derived from the same root. So they must have the same law. So from here, we would not be able to derive that striking someone in a matter that's shameful is forbidden, right? But injuring is forbidden even if it's not shameful. You can't make that distinction if you're deriving from the same verse. Following?
Injury is not shameful.
Rabbi Goldstein's arguing that injury that isn't shameful is still forbidden. Meaning even if you're doing it for cosmetic surgery, still forbidden. Rabbi Feinstein is saying striking and injuring come from the same verse. And if the same verse is qualified as strife and shameful, therefore the prohibition, whatever prohibition you're deriving from that verse, is limited to shameful and strife. And therefore cosmetic surgery, which isn't shameful, it isn't strife, is permissible. This is his argument. So, if so, injuring someone is also dafke derech nitzayon u'bizayon, only when it's in strife or in shame. And this condition that Rambam writes, that the prohibition of hitting someone else is limited to when it's done in a manner of shame and strife, this applies ala chayvel, to injuring, and on hitting, to you cannot differentiate between two things that are derived from one verse. Clear? So let's recap where we're at. Let's recap where we're at.
Only if it's a game. You're allowed to do it, of course.
Right, so let's recap where we're at. Rabbi Feinstein tells us there's two views. There's Tosfos and there's Rambam. We'll get these two views clear, and then everything we learn forward will be much easier to follow. Because what we're going to follow now is going to be either support to Rambam or a seeming contradiction to Rambam, and then we're going to have to resolve the contradiction on Rambam. Because at the end of the day, Rabbi Feinstein maintains Rambam's view, permitting this woman to do the elective surgery, the cosmetic surgery. So here are the two views. Tosfos says that if you're foregoing one pleasure for a greater pleasure, no problem. You can take your diet, forego the cake, because you can gain abs. Whatever it is you're trying to gain. Yeah, you're gaining looks. Fine. But if you're doing actual injury, even if you have what to gain, you may not. This is Tosfos' view as framed by Rabbi Feinstein, and therefore, if we were to follow Tosfos, a woman may not do elective surgery because it's injuring, and injuring cannot be done even if there's something to be gained. Whereas the Rambam's of the view that the entire prohibition of hitting someone else, and the same thing is true of hitting oneself, is limited to if this hitting is in a manner of strife and shame. And because elective surgery is not shameful, nor is it in strife, permissible. These are the two views, and Rabbi Feinstein is going to maintain Rambam's view. This is the gist of where we're at, and what we're going to learn now is different supports to this view or seeming contradictions to the view. Now you'll notice that I made little marks in the text, where like square brackets. So those are places that we're going to stop, and then we'll go to the next square brackets, and so on and so forth. I'm skipping certain parts of the responsa because he gets into very technical details about tangent laws, which is not unlike Rabbi Feinstein in general. His view is, his mind is encyclopedic and very nuanced, and he gets into a lot of technical, nuanced arguments on tangential issues. So I'm not going to go down that road. Just stick to the main arguments, and as they bring up various different interesting passages from the Gemara that help us further understand this idea of injuring oneself and what kind of bodily autonomy does Torah give you. Right? That's what the discussion comes down to between Tosfos and Rambam. Torah gives you permission to have, at least from the way that Rabbi Feinstein is framing it, Torah at the end of the day gives you right to do. Sorry?
For gain or beauty.
Yeah, you're allowed. You own your own body, right? And you may do which as you will, except there's a prohibition to injure yourself. Okay, so let's define the prohibition to injure yourself. Anything outside the prohibition of injuring yourself, you can do to yourself. And if the definition of the prohibition is that you may not injure yourself in shameful manner or in an anger manner, then that's the limitation of the prohibition. And if the injuring myself is to gain beauty, then you may. That's essentially. Whereas Teshuva says, no, we're limiting your bodily autonomy a little bit more. You indeed have permission to your own body, which is why you can refrain from eating cake if you want to have the diet, but you can't inflict pain upon yourself. Right? So the whole question comes down to what degree does Torah allow you to do what you want with your body? Right? So just randomly to lay waste to your body, everybody agrees you can't do that. That's injuring yourself. But if there's something to be gained out of doing that injury to yourself, yes or no? And there's the question between Tosfos and Rambam: how far do you go? Clear. But the premise here is that you have autonomy on your body, and the question is if there's any limitations on that autonomy. Right? Now, I'm saying this, I'm specifically framing it this way, because when we learned Alter Rebbe and the Rebbe's comment, we're going to see a whole different way of looking at bodily autonomy. But let's first compare it to Rabbi Waldenberg. Rabbi Waldenberg in the Tzitz Eliezer, he didn't discuss the issue of bodily autonomy, but it came from medical autonomy. Medical autonomy. You don't have medical autonomy, is what Rabbi Waldenberg argues, because healing comes from God. So Hashem says, you the doctor, maybe you doctor, you scientist, you medicine, you are my chosen agents to bring healing. And that's it. A complete full limitation on the medical autonomy, so to speak. Right? Coming from a different direction. Rabbi Feinstein begins with, it's your body, do whatever you want. If Torah doesn't limit you, do it. Torah limits you, don't do it. Rabbi Waldenberg says, whoa, Hashem is in charge here. And Hashem says, you can heal yourself. Good, heal yourself. That's it, don't do anything else. See the difference in angle? Okay. So again, we're going to see soon from the Rebbe, it's going to be a whole different way of looking at it.
Tosfos is against the whole fasting business and all rolling in the ends, and there's no, anything that's torturing you.
Yeah. So when it comes to fasting,
That's all of it.
when it comes to fasting, again, we'll have to wait. Out there was going to make an interesting line about fasting, which Rebbe quotes a number of times.
Fasting is torturing.
Fasting considered Injure, yeah.
You see it is. So
Right.
it is-
So, but remember, but remember, fasting. Okay, fasting is not the actual infliction of pain, but the refraining of pleasure. And if I gain something out of the refrain from pleasure, I'm allowed to, right? So I'm forgoing one pleasure for a different pleasure. So what if I get Teshuva out of my fasting? That's what the Rebbe argues. Because Teshuva is something you gain out of fasting, you can forgo the delight of eating for a day for the gain of Teshuva.
So it's like
It's
a zero.
torturing yourself.
That's like the nuz. That's right. That's like the diet, but on a spiritual sense, right? A spiritual gain, not a physical gain.
Okay, but the other
Yeah.
stuff, no.
But just more, yeah,
It's the ants and the snow business.
yeah. Rambam, yeah. Seemingly, Tosfos to say, even if you're gaining Teshuva, you cannot hit yourself in the back. You can't roll in the ants. I don't know, whatever. You roll in the snow. It's only if you're refraining from pleasure that you can do for gain. This, you'd be correct. Seemingly, that would be correct. Okay, let's look at now source page number 3. Let's look at the Gemara.
One thing's a little bit different because one thing not eating, but not eating completely is like
In the fridge
rolling
more.
in the ants. If you refrain just from one pleasure, yeah, but
see,
you are torturing yourself by not eating at all.
It is
It's a
torture,
different
but
ballgame.
it's a very subtle type of difference. But the difference is it positive or negative? Right?
Everything, even the rolling is so everything's at the end you're gaining out of it.
No, it's rolling in this.
Yeah, but
It's not rolling in the end,
By not eating, you feel bad.
but it's not a positive action. It's an inaction. That's what I mean by negative. Negative in the sense that you're not doing anything. It's an inaction, and an inaction is permitted against the gain of something else. This is the subtlety. It's a subtlety. This is a. But again, he rejects that because he ends up going with Rambam anyway. Thank you.
It's actually an action. The action is not eating.
But not eating is not an action. You just described it as not.
Okay, all right.
It's an inaction. Your description of it was not eating. It's an inaction.
Yeah, the action is eating. So
That's correct.
the inaction is not eating.
That's right. Like the diet. I'm not eating the cake for the sake of beauty. Okay, so let's go to page 3 of the source sheet. Let's look at the Gemara. The text is like this. This text comes from the Gemara in Baba Kama. The Gemara in Baba Kama is the same Gemara which had this Mishnah where Rabbi Akiva said that the woman who took off her own hair covering and poured oil on her head was forbidden to do so because she publicly shamed herself, and you're not allowed to do that. And I remember I mentioned that the Gemara goes back and forth to try to find who is the source that maintains this. And the Gemara concluded it was Rabbi Eliezer HaKafar, Rebbe, who maintains that the Nazir is a sinner. Right? That was the Gemara's conclusion. But the Gemara goes through like a whole page of back and forth before it comes to that conclusion. And the Gemara suggests a number of texts and then rejects them. So the Gemara introduces a text and says, well, maybe this is the source, and the Gemara rejects it. The Gemara introduces another text and says rejects it, until finally it settles on the text of Rabbi Eliezer HaKafar, who says that the Nazir is a sinner. So one of the texts the Gemara introduces is this prohibition of tearing one's clothing, and try to use that, destroying one's property and so on. So the Gemara says like this. So here's that part is not relevant, and I didn't quote that text because that text is complex a bit.
What's the story with the clothing?
It's a prohibition against tearing clothing.
Why do you tear clothes?
Sorry?
If someone dies, Kriya, or just
No, Kriya you're allowed to, but beyond that you're not allowed to. Right? Kriya you're supposed to,
right.
tearing clothing.
So what's the deal with it?
I don't remember the Gemara is talking. It's a right. Oh, so maybe it was tearing garments because a person's angry about some event, not a death. I don't remember right now. But anyway, this main point is here. The Gemara rejects the suggestion. The Gemara rejects the notion that the source for the prohibition against injuring yourself comes from the prohibition against rending your own garments. The Gemara says like this: perhaps garments are different than the body, in that tearing them is a loss that is irreversible. You can tear your clothing and sew it back; it's never going to be the same. And this follows the practice of Rabbi Yochanan, who would refer to his garments as my honor. Machbudi, he called it my honor. And like the practice of Rav Chizda, who, when he would walk amongst thorns and shrubs, would raise his clothing, despite the fact that his skin would get scratched by the thorns. He said, in explanation of his actions, the flesh will heal if it's scratched, but the garments will not heal if torn. Similarly, perhaps it is a prohibition to rend one's garments, but it is permitted to injure oneself.
Wow.
The Gemara rejects, again.
Sure, that's
One second, this is the Gemara's rejection. Right, the Gemara is trying to find a source for who's the one, what's the source of this idea that one can't hurt himself? And the Gemara suggested maybe the source is this idea, the prohibition of tearing your clothing. And the Gemara is saying, no, that's not a proof, because tearing clothing is not the same thing as injuring yourself. Because injuring yourself, it'll heal, at least if the damage is not so great, and tearing clothing won't heal. This is the Gemara. But the main point here is the story of Rav Chizda. Even as we conclude that it's forbidden to hurt, damage yourself, Rav Chizda, though, would raise his clothing and allow himself to get injured by the thorns and shrubs. How is he allowed to do that?
Exactly.
How is he allowed to do that? So however you're going to define the prohibition against injuring yourself, it must preclude something like Rav Chizda. No, so what does Rabbi Feinstein do with this statement? How does it help Rabbi Feinstein's position?
That you'll have to heal, you'll have to torture, you'll have to make it
because
damage
what?
yourself. You could do it for a gain.
Because he was walking somewhere for a gain.
Right.
Because he was what?
Walking somewhere for a gain. He wasn't rolling in the thorns and the bushes because he was bored. He was trying to get somewhere. And to gain, or the gain was, let's say, he's saving his clothing. Which means, Rav Chizda's practice demonstrates that a person can damage himself. This is something to be gained.
So why scratch your skin when
this is a hard
when he can what?
This is not
why scratch your skin when you can just walk through the
because then he'll tear his clothing.
I don't understand.
And clothing you can't fix.
Yeah.
The scratches will heal.
But that's pain. That's pain.
So which means so this story is proof positive that there are circumstances in which a person is allowed to inflict pain upon himself.
For the sake of his clothing, which can be replaced.
Yeah. Well, no, he said on the reverse. His clothing can't be replaced. Let's assume he's a poor person and he can't replace his clothing. And ruining his clothing is a problem. Or moreover, his gain is that he's getting to the other side where he's trying to get somewhere. Right? But however you're going to square it, however you're going to understand the prohibition of hurting yourself, you have to allow for Rabbi Chizda's actions. And this is proof of Rabbi Rambam's view.
Here it's about the clothing. Now he wants to get to the other side.
Let's see how Rabbi Feinstein position. Let's see how Rabbi Feinstein says it.
This is very hard.
This is very circumstantial, actually.
It's not an easy thing.
It's very circumstantial. I mean,
that's right. It's circumstantial. What's the gain and what's the loss? You're right. It's circumstantial.
Who else holds from this?
This is the Gemara mentioned the story.
Rabbi Chizda.
So, but the Gemara doesn't say that Rabbi Chizda behaved incorrectly because so and so says you're not allowed to. The Gemara doesn't say that. You want to get into the Kabbalah? I don't know, but this is the fact of the law. So let's see now. Rabbi Feinstein, third paragraph on the right of page 8. The Hebrew, back to Rabbi Feinstein's text. We can bring now a proof, l'shittas Rambam, to the view of Rambam. Rambam's view again is that if there's something to be gained, one may inflict a wound upon oneself. One may injure oneself if there's a gain. So what's the proof? That which the Gemara says in Baba Kama, which we cited to earlier. When Rav Chizda would walk through thorns and shrubs, he would raise up his clothing. Amar, he said, this, my body, the scratches will heal. This, my clothing, will not heal itself if it gets ripped. End quote from the Gemara, which we just read. So says Rabbi Feinstein, if every kind of injury is forbidden, how is he permitted to walk through the thorns and shrubs without his clothing protecting him? Which would mean he's inflicting pain upon himself, he's injuring himself. Seemingly, he would be in violation of the prohibition to injure himself. Now, even though his intention is not to decidedly hurt himself, maybe you want to differentiate and say, if I take a hammer to my hand, I'm decidedly injuring myself, forbidden. But if I'm walking somewhere and by the by I happen to injure myself, that's permitted. Says Rabbi Feinstein, you can't do that. Why? Because psik resha, this is considered a psik resha. Psik resha is a rule in the laws of Shabbos, or in general a rule, but specifically comes up in Shabbos. Psik resha literally means cut off a head. The Gemara's expression is like this: a person who rips off the head of a chicken on Shabbos and says, I didn't mean to kill the chicken, I just needed the head because I wanted to use it for something or other. So the Gemara's refrain is, psik resha, you're pulling off a head, v'lo yamos, and the chicken's not going to die, meaning it's an inevitable action. So even if you didn't intend for this, but the act of ripping off the head, whether you wanted the death or not, part and parcel of what you're doing is death to the chicken. So don't convince me otherwise. And therefore, if he's walking through the thorns and bushes, it's not like he's definitely going to get hurt. Right? The doichik leimar, it's difficult to say that his walking through the thorns and bushes was in such a manner that it wasn't automatically he was going to get injured. No. He was definitely going to get injured as he walked through there. And yet, it was permitted. What's the proof it was permitted? He did it. Seemingly the Gemara should protest and say, you weren't allowed to do that. The Gemara doesn't do that. The Gemara maintains this as a story to indicate that damaging clothing is worse than damaging yourself, because damaging yourself, it'll heal if it's a scratch, and damaging clothing, it won't heal itself. So how is he allowed to do that? Therefore, we must say, this is proof to Rambam's view, that the prohibition of inflicting injury upon oneself is only if it's done in strife. The kiv or shame. The kiv because he was walking somewhere and he had some gain. So he doesn't say the gain is the clothing. He says the gain is just by going somewhere. But let's just say the gain was clothing. What's the difference? This is not considered strife. I'm angrily walking through the shrubs and thorns and shrubs to hurt myself. That might be forbidden. But over here, he's going somewhere. This is the shortcut. He's trying to save time, whatever he's trying to do. So he's walking through here, and he gets hurt along the way. So what? I got something to gain. So we see a proof to the Rambam that a person may inflict injury if there's something to be gained. And thus, the cosmetic surgery is permissible because there's what to be gained, which is beauty. Okay, let's skip the next paragraph and go to the bottom of the left-hand side. Before we do that, let's look at the Gemara in Sanhedrin, which is in our source sheet, page number 3. Everybody clear so far? Everybody with me? There's a lot of back and forth, but with me? Basic ideas.
The garment thing is a little bit.
Because it says it.
What?
I don't go. It's not. I'm not.
It's just practice.
Right, but we have to, it's right.
Practice.
We have to remember what we think is right or wrong is question number 2. Question number 1 is, what does the Gemara say? If we figure out we understand it, this is question number 2. But the reality is we see what Rav Chizda did. So we have to maintain that this is the law.
He's the only one that holds that.
But the Gemara doesn't bring in a rejection, which means it's a universally accepted practice. The Gemara doesn't say, oh, that was wrong, he shouldn't have done that.
More important than your body.
Right? He said, the clothing, my skin will grow back, but my clothing won't sew themselves. Right? Okay, let's look at the source sheet number 3. A source sheet, page number 3, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Pevav Med Beis, page 86b, the Gemara. This is a very interesting discussion of the Gemara, and we're making some good headway.
But there's another thing also. He said the word halichosai. It's not just about his clothing. I think he has a gain on the other side.
That's what Rabbi Feinstein's arguing. Rabbi Feinstein's arguing that the gain is...
The clothing thing is... Maybe there's some big gain on the other side, so then the choice is...
Even if it's not big. Even if it's not big. Let's say he's going to... There's a gain on the other side. Yeah, you're right. Rabbi Feinstein does say that the gain's on the other side, not the clothing.
Right. That's
right?
Good. Now he said it there.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see the Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Gemara explains. The Gemara is discussing the issue of bloodletting. Remember, we mentioned this last week, I think. Letting blood is makas dam, was an ancient form of healing. A person let blood run out of their body and thus allow the heart to rejuvenate blood, and that was the new blood that was rejuvenated. It was healthier blood, and people would heal themselves in this way. People would actually do it even if they weren't sick. They would have scheduled, every 6 months, every year. The Gemara discusses this. The Gemara discusses laws. But after your bloodlet, you have to rest. You shouldn't get up. You shouldn't this. You shouldn't that. To maintain health for blood.
Cups on your back, hot water cups. That's always done.
No, the Pasha
It says it. Leeches and
all kinds of things.
What's this called? With hot collapses.
Yeah. The Gemara says like this: as Dlem was raised before the sages, what is the halacha with regard to whether his son may let blood for his father? Is he liable for wounding his father? So, in addition, we're discussing here the prohibition of wounding oneself and the prohibition of wounding another. Right? Now here, there's another prohibition, which is specifically maka ava v'imoy. A person may not strike his father and mother. It's a specific prohibition against hitting one's parent, beyond hitting a fellow man. And there's a difference. And we're going to see soon the big difference between the two types of hitting. Now, when you give permission for somebody else to hit you, right? Does that constitute a violation of hitting someone? That's our whole discussion here.
Right.
That's the essence of our discussion.
Therefore, can a father and son spar?
Similar question. But here there's medical gain. Never mind spar, medical gain. That's leisure. This is medical. Can they let blood for his father? So the Gemara says like this. So the Gemara gives two opinions, which come to, let's see the conclusions. Rav Masna says like this. It is written in the verse, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So, just as one would want others to heal him when the need arises, one must heal others when the need arises. It is prohibited for one to do to others only those actions that he would not want done to him. Therefore, it is permitted for one to heal his father, even if in the procedure entails wounding him. So the positive commandment, love your fellow as yourself, which is a positive commandment to do that which is right by others, meaning a medical procedure, specifically defined by love as you love yourself. I want someone else to do the medical procedure on me, so I'm allowed to do it to somebody else. And that commandment overrides the prohibition of hitting the father. And therefore he's allowed to bloodlet his father. Rav Masna's view. Yeah, clear? Rav Bar Chanina says like this. This is derived from so he comes to the same conclusion, but from a different angle. Rav Masna comes straightforward. Love your fellow as yourself. It's a positive commandment that you should help others. So help your father, and that overrides any prohibition to damage your father. Rav Bar Chanina says, this is the juxtaposition between, right, so two things come together in the verses, and oftentimes when two laws are put together in the verses, it's because they teach each other something. So, the following two things are put together. One who strikes a person, and one who strikes an animal. And that's the original discussion in the Gemara there. The Poskim describes the law of hitting someone else's animal and paying, and versus hitting someone else, and the law is there. Maka behema and maka adam. So because the two laws come together, striking another man and striking a human, striking an animal and striking a human, even though the laws are different, but they teach each other certain things. So, just as one who strikes an animal for medical purposes is exempt from paying restitution, a veterinarian doesn't have to pay for amputating the dog's leg, right? So too, one who strikes a person for medical purposes is exempt from liability, and thus is allowed to bloodlet his father. So what's the difference between Rav Masna and Rav Bar Chanina? Rav Masna doesn't just say you're exempt from the liability of hitting your father. He says you should. You're the fulfillment of a commandment. The commandment is love your fellow as yourself, and you have to provide services that you would want provided to you. So go ahead and bloodlet your father. He doesn't say you're exempt.
You
should. Commandment. Go love your father. Whereas Rav Bar Chanina says you're exempt. Why are you exempt? Because we're going to compare it to the hitting of animals. Just like you're not liable if you hit an animal for the sake of medical purposes. So therefore you're exempt if you hit your father for medical purposes.
What's the medical purpose of hitting an animal?
A veterinarian. A veterinarian is amputating the dog's leg because the dog has a leg of an infection. Yeah. So, Rav Chanina comes from exemption, whereas Rav Masna comes a mitzvah. It's a positive commandment. Go ahead and do it because it's to love your fellow as yourself. So even though they come to the same technical conclusion, it's very different the way they come to this conclusion. Clear? Yeah.
Not so, because
what's missing?
What are we talking about? Like it's like a veteran does like an operation. He's not like hitting the animal.
Yeah, but that's considered inflicting injury. I'm removing a leg.
Right.
I'm cutting.
Right.
But it's for the sake of medical purposes, right? That's the whole discussion here. Inflicting injury for the sake of gain. Right, that's the discussion here.
But so then what's the kesher to an animal? I mean, what about a person who does a surgery?
So says Rav Bar Chanina, that's where you derive that law. Because the Torah puts the hitting of a person next to the hitting of an animal, and the hitting of an animal, we know you're allowed to do it for medical purposes. Thus, we derive you can do the same thing for humans because of the juxtaposition. But the point is that hitting the father is only by exemption, whereas Rav Masna says this is by positive commandment. Fulfill the commandment to love your fellow as yourself.
And how does this tie back into cosmetic surgery?
Let's get we're framing. This is okay. Rabbi Feinstein's going to cite to this. Let's see. Okay. So now the Gemara continues. Hold on a second. Did I quote the wrong part of the Gemara? Oh my gosh, I didn't quote the right part of the Gemara. That's no.
Something's ringing.
I don't know who this is. Okay, let's see.
Yeah.
This is still important. Oh. Yes, no, this is the right thing. So the Gemara challenges this. This is the right Gemara. Yeah, let's see. The Gemara challenges this and says, if so...
You're on the other side?
Yeah. If so, next page, page 4, top. There's a line before this in the Gemara in Sanhedrin that I should have quoted. Oh no, sorry, it's there, right there. The Gemara relates. I thought I skipped it. No, I didn't skip it. Okay, the Gemara is right there. The Gemara relates. Rav. Okay, so we have two positions about the permissibility of bloodletting a father. Love your fellow, positive command, or exemption because it's for medical purposes, and that's derived from the juxtaposition of striking an animal. So the Gemara relates. Is it my phone? No, it's not. Yeah, okay, no worries. The Gemara relates.
Anything, a lot of times it says it's better that you shouldn't do it to your father. I remember learning a lot of places, even though you're allowed to, still don't do it.
That is the halakha at the end, that it better if somebody else does. And I think in medical practice also, they don't allow doctors to operate on family because of emotional connection.
Exactly.
And you want the doctor to be unemotional and cold and intellectual in his decision making. Let's just assume that the case is here with nobody else available to do it. I don't know. Let's assume. Okay, the Gemara relates. Rav did not allow his son to extract a thorn from him. Why? Due to the concern that his son would unwittingly wound him. And it's a prohibition to wound one's father. So Rav, if he had a thorn stuck in his thigh or whatever, he would ask someone else to take it out. He wouldn't let his son do it. No problem. Mar, son of Ravina, did not allow his son to pierce his blister, lest he wound him, which would be an unwitting violation of a prohibition. Yeah? Clear? The Gemara is relating to incidents that's related to father-son healing. The Gemara continues. The Gemara challenges this. The Gemara now challenges the position of Rav and Mar Baravina, Mar, son of Ravina. These people who didn't allow their sons to do these procedures, remove the thorn or pop blister. The Gemara says, if so, if you're worried that your son is going to violate a prohibition, this should be a concern when another who is not his son treats him as well, as it is prohibited for one to injure another. So Rav didn't allow his son to remove the thorn because maybe he's going to end up hitting him, and that's a prohibition. Well, then don't let anybody do it, because that's also a prohibition to hit somebody else.
It's a difference in gain.
Well, no. So if there's a gain, then it should be permitted for everybody.
Still, no. It's
What's the difference between son and somebody else?
Father and son is a different.
No, from the halachic perspective.
They're
both forbidden.
The problem with the halach is because of kibbutz of aim. That's the halach.
No, because it's not just kibbutz of aim. There's actually
what else is there?
there's loisa say maka of if imar bois yumas.
Ignoring that, we're saying that you're allowed to.
Right, but Rav says he wouldn't let his son remove a thorn because he might end up hitting him.
Because it's his son.
But if there's because he didn't want his son to violate a command. If somebody else hits him, it's also a violation.
No, I thought this whole thing is not because of his son, not because of anyone he wouldn't let. Why this picking Dafke's son? He's saying it's Dafke's son. He does.
That's the question the Gemara is asking. What's the difference between son and somebody else? If you're worried about causing someone else to do a violation, then someone else who does it also might be violating by hitting you.
Where there's a son.
You know, like this. If it doesn't constitute hitting, if it doesn't constitute wounding because it's medical, let your son do it.
Then what do you mean by violation?
One second. The act of removing a thorn, does it constitute hitting or not? If it constitutes wounding, then don't let anybody do it. And if it constitutes healing, let your son do it. But the Gemara says Rav didn't let him do it because of the unwitting hitting. What does he by mistake end up hitting? If he overdoes the procedure.
His father. That's the whole problem. Nothing else.
From the halakh perspective, what's the difference? They're both forbidden.
Much more.
Put the motion aside.
The Ten Commandments.
That's an emotional argument. That's not a halakhic argument.
But it sounds like an
Keep is much more important.
You're putting the pecking of but the prohibition is the prohibition.
But he said unwitting, so it almost sounds as though there might be an outside chance of happening.
Which means if I overdo the procedure, I might accidentally hit him.
Well,
along the way.
But there still is a good chance that he may not wound his father.
That's right.
But if he said I'm sorry,
so he says I'm sorry for his son, but not for somebody else.
Yeah.
That's not a halachic argument.
I know,
That's a personal preference argument. I'm okay with somebody else accidentally sinning, but I don't want my son accidentally sinning.
The level of father and son versus someone
So let's see. Let's see what the Gemara says. The Gemara explains there is a distinction between father and son versus somebody else. As when another treats him, the concern is that the individual would be unwitting violation of a prohibition. It's a prohibition against hitting a fellow man. And if I accidentally hit the person as I'm taking out his thorn, my hand slips and I scratch him as I'm taking out the thorn, let's say, or I twist it too much and I hurt him, right, unnecessarily, it's a violation of a prohibition. By contrast, when his son treats him, the concern is that he would be unwitting violation of a prohibition punishable by strangulation, by death. Maka av v'imoy mois yumas. A person who strikes his parent is liable to capital punishment. So there's a difference here in halacha to how bad the prohibition is. If I hit somebody else, it's a prohibition and there's lashes involved, or I pay the damages of the, not lashes, I'm sorry, I pay the damages, whatever. So if I accidentally hurt someone during a procedure, so I violated a prohibition accidentally. But if I accidentally hurt my father while I'm doing a procedure, now it's even though I'm not actually going to get killed because I wasn't warned and I was by accident, but the prohibition is of a higher level because Torah says that in theory there's capital punishment for this kind of prohibition.
Even though it's accidental?
No. So saying, but if whenever Torah provides a punishment for a certain action, right? Most times the person doesn't get that punishment because it has to be done on purpose and it has to have two witnesses with warnings and all that stuff. So what's the point of the different types of punishments? It's not just for the theory of if the person's liable, he'll get those punishments. That's true, but it's much more to tell you what class of sin is this. When you know what kind of punishment the Torah gives in the theoretical sense that the person was liable for it, it tells you what class of punishment it is. So that gives you a pecking order of which sins override what. Torah says that this sin is liable for capital punishment, you can put it up here. If it's excision, it's way up here, like Yom Kippur, for example, is excision. Right? And if Torah says all you get is lashes, we put it lower on the pecking order. So if you have two unwitting prohibitions in front of you, somebody else do it, he might end up hitting me, prohibition. My son does it, he might do it, prohibition also. But this prohibition is the kind for which there is capital punishment, even though he's not going to get capital punishment. But it's the kind of prohibition for which there is capital punishment, indicating that prohibition is much more severe than the other guy doing it to me. So I'll let the other guy do it to me rather than my son. Not because I care for my son more than the other, but because the sin is worse.
Yeah, but you can say
Clear.
It's only worse when you do it in that way. The whole thing that you're going to get killed is dafka when you're warned in that.
That's what I'm just saying. That's what I'm saying. Even if the capital punishment isn't administered, but it tells you the pecking order of the sin.
Yeah, but the whole order is only because you're going to be warned, not.
Yeah, it's the condition only happens if it's warned. But l'poyol, it's the kind of sin for which capital punishment is assigned by Torah, even though this person's not going to get it. Right? So I have an option: make my son accidentally violate a prohibition for which the Torah says there's capital punishment, versus maybe make somebody else accidentally sin for a lower prohibition. I'll take the lower prohibition over the higher. So again, it's interesting. It's not because of an emotional argument. I don't want my son to get a sin, but because the sin my son would get is worse than the sin that somebody else would get. And if my son get the higher sin.
So you look at the outcome then.
Yeah,
the possible outcome.
That's right. So this is the Gemara. Now let's see Rabbi Feinstein and how he uses this in the question of cosmetic surgery, and we'll stop with after that.
So here's one of the places you can see there is difference in the sins.
Oh, certainly.
Not like you say you can't. We don't know who to judge.
Yeah, that's right.
Right here.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so it says Rabbi Feinstein, ach l'chora, but seemingly. So again, Rambam's position is this is what we're dealing with. Back to the Hebrew text, Rabbi Feinstein. Yeah, the bottom left, we have like a little square brackets. The square bracket says I made, not the. Ach l'chora, yes. Bottom left of Reish Sadik. So Rabbi Feinstein says, quoting Rambam, he understands Rambam to mean that the prohibition to inflict injury on somebody else or even yourself is limited to when there's no gain, and therefore the striking is shameful or in strife. But if there's something to be gained, it's permissible. Right? This is how Rabbi Feinstein understands Rambam. So now it says Rabbi Feinstein like this, ach l'chora, but seemingly yiksha, we can ask Sanhedrin, from the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Pei Daled Amud Beis on page 84b, which is the Gemara we just read. Dalma de Rav lo shavik lebrei. The Gemara says regarding Rav, who did not allow his son lemishkale slua to take out a thorn, and the Gemara says that why didn't Rav let him? Because maybe he'll accidentally inflict damage upon him, and that's a prohibition. The Gemara asks, if so, achenami, then somebody else should also not be allowed because the other guy is also a prohibition, right? So now, what's Rabbi Feinstein's argument? Question: why does this pose a contradiction to Rambam? The Gemara's question. But the Gemara says that Rav didn't allow his son to take out the thorn because maybe he's accidentally going to wound him. The Gemara asks, well, somebody else also might be wounding you, and that's also a prohibition. According to Rambam, what's the prohibition? Only if it's strife and shame. Taking out a thorn is strife and shame. So even if he accidentally hurt him unnecessarily, it's still not a prohibition because it wasn't strife and shame. You asked me to do it for you. So why is the Gemara asking that maybe someone else shouldn't be allowed to? And the Gemara answers, well, really, actually, it is an unwitting prohibition, but it's a lesser unwitting prohibition than the unwitting prohibition of the father. What do you mean? It's not a prohibition at all because it was not strife and shame. Seemingly, so this seems a contradiction to Rambam's position. So says the Gemara, says Rabbi Feinstein, V'chabalazu, this damage of pulling out the thorn and twisting too much accidentally, this is not strife, nor is it shame. Kivin the kavanasa, because the intention of the one who's removing the thorn, is to take away the thorn. The leika iser, and there's no prohibition. Turn to the next page. The lo yosef, and there's no prohibition of lo yosef. Remember, this is we have to keep track here now. The prohibition to strike somebody else comes from the fact that the Torah says, do not increase to the number of lashes that the person is liable for, and that's the prohibition to say don't hit somebody else. But what's the prohibition to hit a father? Not from that prohibition. It's a separate one. It's the prohibition there is a straight out verse. Thou shalt not hit thy father or mother. If you do, he's liable for capital punishment. So two prohibitions. So the classification of the prohibition to hit somebody else is not the same classification to hit a parent. So maybe when it comes to a parent, the prohibition is even if it's not in strife.
All over.
But when it comes to somebody else, it's only in strife. And maybe there's a distinction. So why would the Gemara have to say that the prohibition is actually the same, but just one's a higher level, one's a lower level? Seemingly not the same prohibition at all. It's something like this. And therefore it's not the same. Somebody else hitting the person accidentally as a result of pulling out a thorn is not the same leben ba'aviv, to a son to a father. Because when it comes to a son and a father, even without strife and without shame, nami chayiv b'chenek. He's still liable for strangulation, still liable for capital punishment, even if it's not, only if it's on purpose and so on and so forth, right? The nismayit rak makar l'rafua, because the only type of damage that the Torah allows a father to do to his son is bloodletting, which is straight up medical. A son to a father is only if it's medical. And if accidentally I do anything that's not medical, I'm in violation accidentally. Even if it wasn't in shame, and even if it wasn't in strife. Which means, Mayor, to your point, according to this, a father and son would not be allowed to spar. Because this whole idea that you may hit somebody else if it's not in strife or shame is only if it's between one man and another. Strangers. But father and son, the prohibition is universal except for medical procedures. Which means a person cannot go boxing with his father. Even if we're going to take Rambam's view that you're allowed to box a fellow man because there's gain to be had as a result of the striking, but not your father, because that permissibility of striking someone for gain is not for the sake of, or allowing yourself to be stricken for gain is not when it comes to a father. Because when it comes to a father, the only permissibility is medical, that's it, which is the bloodletting issue.
But we could say that for medical purposes, it's an exercise. It's exercise, it's physical.
You do exercise not hitting your father too.
No. Yeah.
But yeah, in theory, you can probably go down that route and say, what is it? What I'm sparring with. I'm using a sparring sword, or like they do fencing. We don't actually hit because because it's a plastic one. Okay, so not actually hitting him. You can go down the road but certainly, hitting your father, even if there's a gain to be had, is forbidden, right? So let's see. Therefore, we have to say, therefore, we must conclude that the what's called the chash, the suspicion, the dilmo chavabay, that perhaps when he's removing the thorn, he's going to hit him, he's going to injure him, he's going to hurt him, is tvei mimashu b'derech refuah. It must be more than a regular procedure. So every medical procedure runs the risk that I'm going to hurt the patient unnecessarily. But when it comes to this issue of removing the thorn, it must have been a much greater suspicion. Because the suspicion that I might hurt my father during a medical procedure must be permitted, because there is always some risk. But this case must have been more. He gives a citation to the Nemuka Yosef, who quotes the Ramban, which we learned about Ramban earlier, where there he says this idea that medical procedure is allowed even though it runs a risk of maybe you're hurting the patient. But this, removing the thorn, must have been a much worse case where the possibility of damaging is much higher.
This is worse than an operation?
So it's not worse than an operation, but the question is, it's worse in the sense that there's a worse chance of unnecessary damage. An operation can be much more damaging because you're cutting open who knows what, but it's not unnecessary. Right? So if I'm in a sterile room doing an operation, what are the chances that I'm going to unnecessarily hurt the patient? Not that I failed the operation and God forbid and the patient, the operation wasn't successful. The operation is successful, but what chance is there that it's going to be unnecessary damage? There's some risk, but how big is the risk? But when I'm yanking out a thorn, for some reason, in that case, there must have been a much greater risk. Because otherwise, you never let a father... the Gemara began by saying a son is allowed to perform bloodletting on the father, which means you're allowed to do medical procedures. And yet the Rav says he didn't let his son take out the thorn. Why? So it must be that the risk of damaging during the thorn was of a higher risk than a regular medical procedure. That must be the case.
Because maybe the thorn's not really a medical procedure. It's different.
Maybe it's not a medical procedure. It's a minor medical procedure. Meaning the only reason why his son's allowed to, let's say the son was a professional. Let's say the son was a professional and he was able to do it where it's going to hurt the father because it always hurts when the thorn comes out, but it won't hurt unnecessarily. Right? He's still doing it because it's a medical procedure, even though he's generally speaking not allowed to hurt his father. Might want to pass the water, please.
There had to be something with that thorn because it looks like right.
Yeah, that's what he's saying. There must have been some sort of risk here of hurting him beyond what's necessary, more than ordinary medical procedure like bloodletting.
Otherwise, you shouldn't be able to.
But there's also the case of the blister.
Or the blister also might unnecessarily hurt him. There's two cases, yeah.
The blister.
Yeah, there's two cases.
And they're both medical procedures.
But a blister.
So let's see.
Get infected.
So he quotes the Nemuka Yosef that explains the Gemara. Bakavana, the intention in this Gemara is this was in such a way that there is the possibility to remove the thorn and pop the blister without any unnecessary injury. But the child won't be able to properly be careful because he's all distracted. And therefore, maybe. And this extra injury, that is shameful and that is considered strife. Because this is what he's saying. Why? Because it's not needed medically. And this self-constraint that as a rule a person is supposed to be in control of his behavior. And the lack of his concern, the lack of his delicacy and care to not unnecessarily wound his father, right, is right? Again, Nachmal.
Being nervous like that.
Yeah. Because of his laziness to be careful. Oh, meaning it's his laziness to not be extra careful in this case because he's all distracted. That constitutes like a negative version of him being in strife and shame because he's unnecessarily going beyond medical procedure by his laziness to not be careful. or because of his distraction, he can't be careful. And therefore, and therefore, and that's what the Gemara asks, that the same is true of somebody else if the person can't control his, or the person is unnecessarily not controlling his being careful. So I'll make the argument like this. Because it's such a simple procedure, the guy's going to say, oh, no big deal, just yank it out. And he won't take, I'm arguing the other way. When you're a doctor in a medical room with the fancy operation and you're in a thing, so you're very careful of every movement you do because you know the risks are high. So in that case, you're not going to do any extra damage more than necessary because you're careful the whole time. But when your father says, can you please take out the thorn? You're not careful and you yank it out. That lack of care, because you think it's no big deal, that is the violation of the prohibition. That's the derech bizoyin and nitzayin. That's the shame and strife.
Yeah, but there's no strife in bizoyin. Those two words don't fit in there. I understand what you're saying. The lady, you could.
Yeah, you're right.
Hurt the father, but the word bizoyin and strife. They didn't want to.
Right. So this is how he settles to make sure that this Gemara is not a contradiction to Rambam. Rambam, which said that the prohibition is only when it's strife and shame. And Rabbi Feinstein asked, well, if that's the case, why the Gemara say that it's forbidden, or why the Gemara suggests that it would be an unwitting prohibition for somebody else to take it out? Seemingly, it's not shame and strife. And so Rabbi Feinstein, well, the shame and strife is his lack of care to be extra careful, which is why the Gemara asks, don't allow anybody to do it because they're also going to violate unwittingly. And the Gemara answers because the unwitting here is less than the unwitting there, right? So next week we'll see how Rabbi Feinstein is going to take this very Gemara itself, turn it around, and use it as a proof positive for Rambam. And he's going to take us back to the issue of that you're allowed to bloodlet your father. And the way the Gemara discusses that, we're going to see how that's going to support Rambam's view, not pose a contradiction as we're settling now, but it's actually even going to support Rambam's view. Okay, so we still have more. God willing, next week we'll finish this responsa, and we'll get to the Alter Rebbe, which I keep on hyping it up because I'm telling you, the Alter Rebbe and Rebbe is going to change a whole frame, and Rabbi Zevin is going to quote the Alter Rebbe to resolve the story of the Merchant of Venice, the case of Shylock. Yeah,
Venice.
Yeah, the Merchant of Venice. You know the Merchant of Venice?
Yeah.
Right here.
The Shakespearean anti-Semitic story. Yeah, that's right.
Pound of flesh.
So let's frame it already. Rabbi Zevin has a whole essay on what would be the law if Shylock came to a Jewish court, right? Right, where the one who owed the money said, "Here's my flesh, take it," right? And what would a Jewish court rule in such a case? Just to pay the money back or not pay the money back, right? So it's also again a question of self-inflicted damage for gain. I'm damaging my flesh, but I'm gaining that I don't have to pay the guy back, right? So it comes down to this whole back and forth discussion. And Rabbi Zevin goes back and forth about the prohibition of hurting yourself and a whole back and forth. At the end, he quotes the Alter Rebbe and puts a twist on it that way. And we'll see if we can use that frame for this also. It's going to be very, very interesting. Huh?
You're not a ball of boss on your body. It's God's property.
You're just spoiling. Okay, looking forward, God willing, next week. We'll have to wait and see. We might be on Zoom next week, depending on what the law is. Okay, we're good. Next.